So when we talk about care ethics, we have to kind of think about its youth. As a new ethic, we have to understand that care ethics came out of a bit of psychology and a bit of critical theory and a bit of sociology. It really didn't get its hooks into philosophy until a bit later. Once it became a full non-descriptive ethical system and more normative, then ethicists jumped on it and started, just belting out work. And it was pretty quickly discovered that for one, it's an amazing system. And for two, it's a system that's been generally practiced but ignored by half the human population for a very long time. Care ethics is rather firmly situated in feminist theory. Now, if that word scares you, I've got some news for you. Understanding what that means as an academic discipline, what it means as a human movement, and what it means for our world are pretty important to being able to get through life nowadays, both for women and for men, and for non-binaries for that matter. So understanding what feminist ethics is, and understanding what feminist theory is pretty much necessary in every aspect of life. But having an entire theory that's dedicated to, or an entire ethical theory that's dedicated to feminist theory is eye-opening, to say the least, at least from the academic side. It was especially eye-opening for me as a male and as a philosopher, because the academic tradition in philosophy is just as male-centric as pretty much any other discipline. So having a new theory that's presented in such a way that it kind of shows in a rather blatant way the way people have been acting all along, and by people I mean well over half, not just women and females, but just in general, people act this way. And because it didn't fit with the analytical or more academic side of philosophy, it was somewhat ignored as a theory. It was understood within psychology as a descriptive, so people could look at it and say, yes, this is how people act. But whether there was a theory attached to it that claimed that people should act this way, like I said, 45 years. It's brand new in the grand scheme of how philosophical theories work. And it's by far, by hundreds of years, the newest that we will have tackled. As far as its power or its ability to convince and those kinds of things, it's as strong a theory as any of the others that we've talked about. It does not have the same body of scholarship behind it, but it was picked up with fervor. So there is a good amount of work for you to do your bibliographies on. And I think you'll find it quite interesting. This week's discussion, though, is a good deal different from the kinds of discussions that we've done in the past. Read carefully. Read carefully. Your grade depends on it. This is one of the few where you are absolutely required to respond to anyone who comments on your posts, right? So you have to respond. Your post should be something not necessarily provocative, but it should be something that invites commentary, right? And it should be complete. So it would be very easy to sort of ignore the subtext and just answer the question as it's asked in the discussion. But that's not very interesting. So provide some commentary, provide a little bit of depth, so that people have something to kind of grab hold of, and discuss. Okay, so discussion this week is going to require a lot more effort than usual, but your bibliography should be fairly cut and dry. So no worries on that part. We've had a few people join us since we started. Did anybody have any issues with the Aristotle? Okay, that's good. This is going to look very similar in a few ways. So care ethics, when it was first scooped up as a ethical theory, was scooped up under the kind of header of virtue, right? Because the theory was discussed in a way that kind of evoked traits. It has since kind of done its rounds. So there is a care ethics that is centered in deontology. There's a care ethics that's centered in consequentialism, and there's the original care ethics, which is definitely a virtue theory or a virtue-based system. So there's quite a bit to dig into. There's also a lot of landmines to dodge. This is a truly interdisciplinary ethical system. So everybody's tried to have a piece of it. Every discipline has tried to get in on care ethics, because in general, it was a hot topic, especially when it first came out, but also it's very compelling. As a system, it's one of those systems that just sort of evokes commentary, right? Some of it is quite negative, and I would be quite interested if anyone runs across some of those more negative approaches or more negative comments on the theory. I'd be interested in your thoughts on those, right? Those are the kinds of things that are going to provoke good discussion in the discussion boards, okay? So it's a powerful week as far as that part goes, and it's timely. Care ethics, while it is a feminist theory, for those of you that know anything about feminist theory, you know that intersectionality is important, and given the current state of our world, it's pretty much right there in, like, if we could have picked a theory to study given the current world environment, this is the one. Good stuff. It's good stuff. It is also a lot more modern in the sense that it is less archaic in the way that it is written and in the way that it is written about. So for a lot of people, it's a little easier to get your head and your hands around. It's also something that we see a lot more often than we realize. You start looking at the theory and reading about it, and you'll start seeing that there's a lot of things that we see in our entertainment, that we see in our day-to-day activities, that people do all the time, and nobody really thought to say, well, that's an ethical action because of this or that. Yet it's the one that, especially in like movies and whatnot, it's the hard decision that the hero has to make, right? The idea that, sacrificing some vast but unknown entity in order to save your friend who is perhaps not the most pure person, but they're your friend, right? So care ethics would advocate for that. Of course you would choose your friend. You have a relationship with that person. Relationships are the center of care ethics. The idea of, so you have to remember, what's our definition of ethics, right? Living a good life and our relationships with other people, managing our relationships with other people. Care ethics is very much focused on the second half, whereas most of our theories up to now have focused on the first half, sort of. deontology and consequentialism sometimes are given a little credit for their managing relationships part, but only insofar as that you aren't allowed to consider them as more important than anyone else. Virtue, of course, is quite happy to accept that you would have preference for those people that are close to you, because that's part of being loyal, right? And loyalty is a trait. Hence why care ethics sort of falls in pretty nicely with virtue. There are aspects of it, though, that get away from the virtue model. Care ethics is less concerned with whole character and more about like in the moment character. How do you act in the moment? Which is important, and it's something that you should definitely kind of keep in the back of your head as you read through this stuff. That every action in care ethics that is morally important only happens in the moment. So thinking about the future or trying to remember the past aren't nearly as potent. They don't have the moral impact that right this minute has on your actions, right? And like I said, that just seems like such an idiotically stupid thing that we should have known from the get-go, right? Of course, right now is the most important action that I could possibly take. Why am I fretting over old stuff, or why am I so worried about some action I have to take later? I need to focus on right now, right? So that kind of presentism is the kind of more meta-ethical concept, but that presentness of being in the moment, all your actions, all of your decisions happen in the moment. For anyone who is impulse bought something, or impulse ate something, or said something that just wasn't well rehearsed, like just kind of came on out, right? If you've done any of those things, you know that there are a lot of decisions that we make in the moment, sometimes not necessarily for the better. But we live now. We can worry about the past. We can learn from the past. We should learn from the past. But we shouldn't worry about the past, right? We should be concerned, but not worried. We shouldn't look back at the past and then consider what kind of person we are, or whether it affects our ability to be good or bad in the future, etc. We should be focused on what actions we're taking right now. Learn from your past. Let your past be a guidebook, a lesson, but that's all, right? That's an important element in most constructions of care ethics. Care ethics as a new theory, and pretty much all theories have gone through this, but as a new theory, it is constantly being kind of reimagined and revitalized, given new central ethics and shifting. I mentioned earlier that feminist theory has a lot of intersectionality. Care ethics has picked up a lot of intersectionality in recent years as that concept has become more widespread and understood. I will say this, and this is kind of important. Care ethics is not as focused on justice as a lot of other ethics, or as much as a lot of people want out of their ethics. They want justice out of their ethics. So even people who are otherwise quite interested in care ethics probably won't buy into it if they are someone who's interested in justice in any way. What I mean by justice is that wrongdoing has a negative consequence, and right action has positive consequence, right? It's the easiest way to describe it. So, care ethics isn't really as concerned with those kinds of things. It's not worried about justice as much. It's how do I interact with this person who's in my face right this minute? Does it change how I interact with this person someday in the future? It may not. All right, so care ethics is a, well, let me take a step back and say, well, let's talk a little bit about the word care ethics and kind of the focus of this particular ethical system. Of course, a lot of people make the mistake, and I guarantee at least one, maybe two people will do this this summer out of either TNCC or ESCC. They will think care ethics means medical ethics. They're not even closely related, not even tangentially related. There are medical ethical systems that have been groomed out of a care ethics viewpoint, but with care ethics being as new as it is, it's much more difficult to base an applied ethical system on care ethics, especially since a lot of what care ethics talks about is focused very individually, and therefore, oh, excuse me, oh, been busting tail since about 6:30 this morning. It's been a long day already. Where was I? Care ethics is not medical ethics, right? As applied philosophy, care ethics is a bit young for there to be a really strong sense of what applications can be sort of permanently pulled out. Now, that isn't to say that it doesn't have the fruit from which a good applied ethic might be born, but it is generally just a little too new. It's a little too new for a good applied ethic to really have stood up and taken root. Medical ethics generally is pretty evenly split down deontological or Kantian deontological and utilitarian way of thinking, right? So if we think of triage, that's a pretty much utilitarian concept, all bundled up into one. But when we think of, you know, what the oaths mean, what kind of person becomes a doctor, especially one of those doctors that isn't as interested in money, those kinds of things. You know, deontology kind of fits into it a little bit better than utilitarianism does when we're talking about that. But when you know, blood starts to flow, the utilitarian concept gets scooped up pretty quick. Virtue really doesn't have much of a place in medical ethics. There's some. They're stronger in nurse and medical practitioner theory than it is with full-on bioethics, but not nearly as big as the two others. So care ethics is kind of trying to muscle in on that. And it's already got a strike against it because virtue doesn't generally tend to kind of lend itself towards medical ethics, let alone other types of applied ethics. So, you know, do with that what you will. You're not going to find a lot of care ethics and medical ethiks intermixed. If you're pulling up medical ethics when you do searches for care ethics, you just have to kind of use some wisdom, right? The reason that I brought up earlier that care ethics, we have to understand the roots of care ethics, is because there's a lot of aspects of the theory that is purely descriptive, right? Its psychological roots are shown in hardcore. It has a ton of psychology built into it. Some of the insights and other shoulds that we get from care ethics are kind of direct translations of intuitions and instincts that we already have, which Hopefully that's not going to be at night, or it's only afternoon at this point. But yeah, so in general, when you're looking for care ethics, just be careful. All right. There's going to be a lot of stuff out there that leads you in weird directions, and there's always going to be at least a handful of you that didn't attend the class, didn't look at the instructions, just said care ethics, cool, doctor ethics, and then I'll get a whole bunch of stuff that is pretty much worthless for our biblio. So yeah, keep your eye on that. Care ethics doesn't have anything to do with applied ethics so far. It's kind of made its plays, especially when you start talking about ethics within the environment. But otherwise, it's just having a hard time muscling its way in. So if you're pulling up a bunch of applied philosophy, applied ethics, it's a pretty good bet that your searches are going in the wrong direction. Bring it back towards ethics in general with the concept of care. So it's care ethics or the ethics of care. Both of those are pretty commonly used as kind of general handles, if you will, for the concepts. All right, so just a quick recap on what we discussed so far. Care ethics is one of the newest ethical systems to take hold and to have strong support. Its original roots are in virtue, but it has made its rounds through each of the ethical systems, or I should say, sorry, not ethical systems, but through the electoral boxes. All right, whoever's yawning on their camera, you need to stop that. And that's what I think of whenever I see a person's name instead of an image. You're just sleeping. Anyway, guilt trip's over. Let's get back to business. So what is then this focus? What is it about care ethics that is so focused on relationships, and how does this impact our ability to do any kind of ethical theory on something that's new? I'm going to show a video because I think this video describes the ethics of care as a concept much more concisely than I can. I've got a decade and plus of studying this stuff, and I've got my own thoughts and opinions on what's right and what's wrong, but some of those are my thoughts, and I don't think it's fair for me to dump those on you. You will find, by the way, we've kind of, with Aristotle, that was our last deep dive into what we consider to be well-established, rigorous ethical systems. Everything after, including this one, is either really new, slightly debunked, or very old on the, whether it be old within a set facility or whatnot, or old kind of across the board. So when we move into care ethics, then if we've kind of covered the big bases, what are we actually doing? Well, like I said, care ethics is an offshoot of virtue originally. But yeah, let's just let the video speak. All right, we'll do it that way. That's the best way to do it. For those of you that are kind of rigorous about watching all the videos and reading everything that I send you, this will look pretty familiar. if I can get it to work. Try that one. Everybody see that okay? Cool. All right, let's get it playing. Now the fun stuff will be if you can hear it.
The ethics of care, alternatively care ethics or EOC, is a normative ethical theory, a theory about what makes actions morally right or wrong. It is one of a cluster of normative ethical theories that were developed by feminists in the second half of the 20th century. While consequentialist and deontological ethical theories emphasize universal standards and impartiality, ethics of care emphasize the importance of response. The shift in moral perspective is manifested by a change in the moral question from what is just to how to respond. Ethics of care criticize application of universal standards as morally problematic, since it breeds moral blindness or indifference. Some beliefs of the theory are basic. 1. Persons are understood to have varying degrees of dependence and interdependence on one another. This is in contrast to deontological and consequentialist theories that tend to view persons as having independent interests and interactions. 2. Those particularly vulnerable to one's choices and their outcomes deserve extra consideration to be measured according to their vulnerability to one's choices. 3. It is necessary to attend to contextual details of situations in order to safeguard and promote the actual specific interests of those involved. Ethics of care is a feminist ethic. While some feminists have criticized care-based ethics for reinforcing traditional stereotypes of a good woman, others have embraced parts of this paradigm under the theoretical concept of care-focused feminism. Care-focused feminism is a branch of feminist thought, informed primarily by ethics of care as developed by Carol Gilligan and Nell Noddings. This body of theory is critical of how caring is socially engendered to women and consequently devalued. Care-focused feminists regard women's capacity for care as a human strength, which can and should be taught to and expected of men as well as women. Noddings proposes that ethical caring has the potential to be a more concrete evaluative model of moral dilemma than an ethic of justice. Noddings' care-focused feminism requires practical application of relational ethics, predicated on an ethic of care. Ethics of care is also a basis for care-focused feminist theorizing on maternal ethics. Critical of how society engenders caring labor, theorists Sarah Ruddick, Virginia Held, and Ava Feder-Kidde suggest caring should be performed and caregivers valued in both public and private spheres. Their theories recognize caring as an ethically relevant issue. This proposed paradigm shift in ethics encourages that an ethic of caring be the social responsibility of both men and women. Joan Tronto argues that the definition of the term ethic of care is ambiguous due in part to the lack of a central role it plays in moral theory. She argues that considering moral philosophy is engaged with human goodness, then care would appear to assume a significant role in this type of philosophy. However, this is not the case, and Tronto further stresses the association between care and naturalness. The latter term refers to the socially and culturally constructed gender roles, where care is mainly assumed to be the role of the woman. As such, care loses the power to take a central role in moral theory. Tronto states there are 4 ethical elements of care. 1. Attentiveness. Attentiveness is crucial to the ethics of care, because care requires a recognition of others' needs in order to respond to them. The question which arises is the distinction between ignorance and inattentiveness. Tronto poses this question as such, but when is ignorance simply ignorance, and when is it inattentiveness? 2. Responsibility. In order to care, we must take it upon ourselves, thus responsibility. The problem associated with this second ethical element of responsibility is the question of obligation. Obligation is often, if not already, tied to pre-established societal and cultural norms and roles. Trunto makes the effort to differentiate the terms responsibility and obligation with regards to the ethic of care. Responsibility is ambiguous, whereas obligation refers to situations where action or reaction is due, such as the case of a legal contract. This ambiguity allows for ebb and flow in and between class structures and gender roles, and to other socially constructed roles that would bind responsibility to those only befitting of those roles. 3. Competence. To provide care also means competency. One cannot simply acknowledge the need to care, accept the responsibility, but not follow through with enough adequacy, as such action would result in the need of care not being met. 4. Responsiveness. This refers to the responsiveness of the care receiver to the care. Trunto states, responsiveness signals an important moral problem within care. By its nature, care is concerned with conditions of vulnerability and inequality. She further argues responsiveness does not equal reciprocity. Rather, it is another method to understand vulnerability and inequality by understanding what has been expressed by those in the vulnerable position, as opposed to reimagining oneself in a similar situation.
All right. So I apologize for the robo voice. The channel that does those videos, which I'm sure you have seen a half dozen of throughout the class. I appreciate what they do, but the robo voice can put even the most diehard meth addict straight to sleep. So think about what's being discussed, right? Now, you'll notice that they spent well over half of the video talking about the counter arguments, the counterpoints. Why? Why do you think it's so important for that particular presenter, whoever it was that kind of created that video? Why do you think it's so important that they mention all of these counter arguments in the process of explaining their system, their ethics, right? Why? Anybody got a guess? Nada, huh? All right, so let me help. Feminism gets a lot of flack. Not just out on the street, not just amongst the patriarchy, but by other women, by other intersectionals. Everybody wants a piece of the pie in a way, and that means that when you have a theory that's that contentious and that wrought with interdisciplinarity, it can be really, really hard to kind of settle on a hard position, right? With utilitarianism, we can settle on a hard position pretty easily, right? We know what it is. Principle utility. Boom, we can sum up utilitarianism in 3 sentences that are not terribly complex. Deontology. A little more difficult. We need 3 formulations of a test, but we can still find a foundation of what it is that we're talking about, right? Virtue theory. That takes a lot of commentary, but the concept is fairly easy for people to get their heads wrapped around. I want to be this kind of person. Therefore, I must practice being this kind of person. That's it, right? So what does care ethics got? It doesn't have any kind of built-in, actions are what matter, and all actions are judged based on their results, right? Can't say that. That's not how care ethics works. There's rules. We should follow the rules. We're morally obligated to follow these rules. We have a duty to follow these rules. That's definitely not care ethics, since care ethics is like your decision is going to be based on who it is that you're reacting to, right? So it's not even just based on the situation. It's based on who the person is that you're dealing with. That's pretty all over the place when it comes to rules. So trying to find that hard and fast rule. It's kind of like virtue theory, right? We've got these 4 core virtues, but they're really almost additive to Aristotelian virtue. So, I mean, is it really something that's all that new? Can't we just call care ethics another type of virtue? So we got all these little charges against the theory that kind of miss the point. They're so busy looking for where it fits in all the categories that they sort of miss the fact that it's the categories that are missing care ethics, not the other way around, right? We have an entirely different way of looking at how we see ourselves or judge others as good. And, as we have already discovered in video, we don't have the luxury of a rule book to go by. We're too busy being reactive and managing our specific interactions with specific people at a specific time. And that can lend itself very quickly to a kind of moral relativism. Anybody know what moral relativism is? Everybody's asleep, as I wish I was. Moral relativism is the concept. It's not a theory, and it's definitely not an ethic. Moral relativism is the concept that what is good and what is bad is kind of opinion. There's nothing to base it on, which is just blatantly false, right? We have all kinds of things that we can base being ethical on, and we see the results pretty much every day of our lives, right? One of the things that's quite interesting about being a teacher of ethics and a doctor of ethics is that when we think about other disciplines and we try to think about so how often are you doing physics in your daily life? You're interacting with physics all the time, but you're not really thinking about physics unless that's your thing, right? You have to kind of want to think about physics before you start thinking about physics. Otherwise, it's just kind of there, right? What about biology, or even for that matter, literature or history? These are all things that you can kind of imagine people interact with sometimes even a lot in their day-to-day lives, right? If you're kind of a history buff and you're interested in that sort of thing, you might know a lot of stuff about your town, maybe even the surrounding area, maybe a particular era of history or a particular human endeavor, right? There's always these little things that we might be into. But you got a job, there's only so much that you can do when you've got a job, right? you got other hobbies, you got other interests. You definitely don't want to spend a bunch of time going to school, all this other kind of stuff. So it's pretty easy to look at even an amateur historian and a true historian and say there's a significant difference. Because people who study history or practice physics or scientific methodology at all, for that matter, or any of these other kinds of things, we can look at those people who are experts and say, sure, expert. They do this stuff all the time. I only do it once in a while. But with ethics, every single one of you practice this stuff every single day. Even sometimes when you're all by yourself, right? You start thinking about how you should manage certain kinds of things in your life, how to live a good life, whether you should do something or not do something, so on and so forth. We're all constantly practicing ethics. So what gives me a right to sit here and talk about ethics to a bunch of people who've been practicing ethics their entire lives, just like me, right? And there's answers to that, but that's not what's important. What's important is that this is actually something that gives people pause. You know, if you sit there and talk to a psychologist or, for that matter, a psychiatrist, or if you, you know, seek therapy, or if you get a lecture from, you know, an authority figure or your parents or whatever, at the end of the day, you're like, yeah, what are you basing all that stuff off of? What gives you the right to say what's right and wrong, and I don't get that kind of say, right? That's where moral relativism comes from. It's this idea that we're all constantly practicing ethics, and even people who are considered experts are really only experts in the sense that they have a concerted focus, right? That their ethics, their practice of ethics is less about their personal practice of ethics and more about what ethics is. So you might think of me as a special kind of mechanic, right? I know how the things work that people do every day. But my 10,000 hours and your 10,000 hours are pretty similar in a lot of ways. I just have language that goes with it, pretty much. So moral relativism gets its wings from this concept that we are all practicing ethics every day, and therefore, you know, anybody can say what is good and what is bad. And like I said, we can, with even just a little bit of thought, we know that that's false, right? There's lots of people who have bad ideas. There's lots of people that have really wrong beliefs. And there's even times where the majority of people have really bad beliefs, and only a small minority of people have, you know, a truly just set of beliefs. So we can't say, well, it's the most people. Most people do this thing, so therefore that's the right thing. Well, unless you are deeply religious, you can't say, well, there's nothing written, you know, there's something written down that tells us how to live our lives. And even if you are deeply religious, unless you are in a very, very, very new religion, there's an awful lot in those books that doesn't cover the kinds of situations that we face every day, right? There's a lot of situations that go on in those books that we will never have to deal with because things have changed, right? The world is a different place. And not just tech, but even the way that we interact with each other, and how we eat our food, and all these kinds of things, right? So being able to point at a thing and say, master of ethics gets their information from here is really hard. It's really hard. So moral relativism then seems to get a lot of weight from that, well, I'm just as good at ethics as anybody else, so therefore I can just do whatever I want. When we see those breakdowns happen, when we see somebody shoot up a school, or if we see someone post up racist flyers or white supremacist flyers, when we see someone assault someone else, whether it be in broad daylight or behind closed doors, pretty easy to understand that there's nothing right about that. And if even one person thinks that that's okay, that that's the way things should be, it sort of breaks down this whole moral relativism thing, right? Because that's at least one person who has a wrong opinion about ethics. And if even one person has a wrong opinion about ethics, that means that what each individual holds as ethically important or ethically true can't be right. Right? We have one negative. We kind of, by elimination, eliminates all the positives. So we need some kind of consensus. How do we do that? Well, ethical theories are a process by which we can try to figure it out. There are some tried and trues, right? We have a definition of ethics that is a tried and true. I want to be a good person. I want to live a good life. I want to be able to interact with other people in a way that is both appreciated and useful. So how do we do those things? You can't do that if you're a moral relativist, because moral relativists don't care about other people. Their opinions about what's right and wrong and my opinion about what's right and wrong are going to conflict. People are just too convoluted. The likelihood that anybody over 30 holds the exact same set of ethical beliefs is pretty much approaching zero, right? I mean, you ask a billion adults who've been practicing ethics for their entire lives. Well, what is ethical? You're going to get a million different answers. So moral relativism doesn't work. And therefore, moral relativism can't be a charge against care ethics. But care ethics seems to go that direction. It seems to kind of hold this idea that the good and the bad are focused in the moment. But that doesn't mean that there's not a wrong, right? And that's one of the problems with moral relativism. Moral relativism doesn't believe that there's a wrong, because if I think something is right, it's right. And if somebody else thinks something is right, it's right. It might only be right for them and not right for me, but it's still right. Does that make sense? Everybody still tracking? Are we on it? Come on, help me out. Let me see some raised hands. All right. Yeah, at least one comment. Thanks. There we go. All right, so it's not moral relativism. It's not consequentialism, because it doesn't seem to be really too focused on actions in general being the determinant. And it's not deontology, because it's not based on rules. And it's not really virtue either, because it's not about what kind of person you are and what traits you hold. But there is a focus. You just have to dig a little bit to figure out what it is. Anybody got a guess based on the video and what we've talked about so far? What's the focus? What is it about an action that makes it right in care ethics?
Is it like serving other people or providing for other people?
Excellent. Very close, not exactly right, but very close, right? It's about how people react to us. So we get that from serving other people or interacting with them in various ways. It's not always about service. Sometimes it can be about just interaction in general. But what makes an action or interaction is probably the better way of putting it, because care ethics is almost entirely focused on interaction and dealing with other people. We've talked about this a little bit before, especially in week 2, the concept that human beings are necessary for each other. But we have that kind of herd pack mentality, and that herd pack mentality means that it's really difficult to be alone for very long, right? People are okay for short bursts of seclusion. Some people are huge exceptions to the rule and go off and live in the mountains and never be seen again, so on and so forth. But even those people that go off and live in the mountains, unless they did that at age 3, they're still building off of the sum total knowledge of human existence and the interactions that humans have had since humans have had history, right? So we're pretty interdependent, and therefore having an ethical system based on that interdependence seems like a good idea. It seems like a pretty smart way to go. So when we're thinking about those 4 core elements that sound an awful lot like virtues, right? When we're thinking about those elements, what we're looking for is the response. We're looking for people to have positive responses to our actions. If people have positive responses to our actions, we've done something right, right? And we're not talking about people far away or people in 100 years or anything like that. We're talking about those people you're interacting with in the moment, right? Does that make sense? So that can be a little difficult to manage. So far, we've been talking about actions having importance based on something that the action does or something that is inherent to the action. In this case, it really doesn't have anything to do with any of those things. In this case, we need to be able to be emotionally and interpersonally intelligent. We need to be empathetic. We need to be able to understand what it is people desire and then work towards those things. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to become suddenly subservient or a flatterer or any of those kinds of things, right? We can provide for the greater good of all in a kind of non-utilitarian sense, of all people present, without bowing and scraping in the process. That's not what's necessary. And a high ruler could be a care ethicist just as easily as a lowly servant. So it is about service, but it's not about servanthood or being a slave or any of that kind of stuff. And it's definitely not about not you. So care ethics does take into account that you are part of the equation. Less important than virtue. In virtue, you are the central concept, right? Not in an egoist way, but in how you become a good person, right? So care ethics is less concerned with that, but it's still, you have to drive this stuff. And then how that person feels when you leave, or how that person feels about what you've done, will determine whether you've done well. And if you do well more often than not, then you're generally going to be considered a good person, right? So let's talk a little bit then for 5 or 6 minutes about intuition and empathy. Now, if you were taking a full-length class, we would have done a full module on intuition. Intuition as a whole is an important element in ethics. You might think of, so there are entire ethical theories based on intuition. The big one is called emotivism. It's kind of this idea that how you feel about an action is what makes it good or bad, right? So, you know, some people joke about it's like if an action makes you go yay, then it's good, and if it makes you go ooh, then it's bad. Do with that what you will. But intuition is what gives us that in this context, right? So we don't want to get it mixed up with the intuition that, you know, holy crap, my kid just got hit by a car. That kind of other definition. This is that kind of first thought that comes to mind when you are confronted with any kind of circumstance, right? So somebody tells me that there's a truck parked out front of the house. My intuition is that it's probably supposed to be there, but I might go check anyway to see if it's supposed to be there, or if it's blocking my car, or if it's doing any damage, or all those kind of things. But my intuition is it's supposed to be there, right? So anybody not got a pretty good handle on what intuition is? Okay, so intuition is really important to care ethics, almost as much, if not more so, than it is in virtue. Virtue is pretty heavily reliant on intuition. It's more interested in cultivating your intuition than it is about intuition as a whole. Whereas care ethics is pretty heavily focused on your intuitions, right? But it's specifically your intuitions on how you can best interact with a person. Now, we have to remember our focus. Our focus is about how people feel about the circumstances. Not necessarily about you, though you are part of the circumstances. But it can be a kind of more generalized sort of thing. In fact, they can even have a negative view of you, but as long as the overall situation is one that makes them feel good about themselves or puts them in a better emotional or thoughtful place, then you've done well, even if they don't really like you for it, right? So it is still possible to do things that, you know, kind of make people go boo, and it still have a positive overall impact. You might think of, you know, those people who make really difficult decisions in politics or you know, anything like that, where right now it might really suck whatever it is that's happening, but very, very quickly the situation resolves itself in some kind of positive way, because, you know, maybe the person used good intuition, or maybe they got lucky, or maybe just making the decision that way in the first place inspired the right kind of reaction, etc. So a good intuition, knowing what kind of things are necessary to be done in a situation to make people better off, emotionally and mentally better off, right? We really don't care about people's well-being in care ethics. The long-term better offness is less of a focus. We don't ignore it in care ethics, right? Care ethics is still focused on living a good life and managing your relationships. It's just more focused on the second half. But that first half isn't lost. It's just way, way, way in the background, right? In the same way that, you know, utilitarianism is the exact opposite. Utilitarianism really doesn't have much dealing with relationship stuff in it at all. It's really more focused on that altruism and living the good life, with the capital G, good being utility, right? So living the utility life. So care ethics is like, yeah, you know, make people happy, they'll like you and they'll like having you around, and that will make you happy because we're all interdependent. If you make a lot of people sad and that makes you happy, the problem isn't the other people, right? That's not the issue. You're the one that's having an issue there as far as the care ethics is concerned. We care about other people. We care about how they interact with us. We care about what they think about us. We care about whether they will to kind of put a sour note on it, whether they'll serve us in the future in some way. But of course, that's not the focus, but it is still sitting there in the grand calculus. But what we can definitely say is that if you surround yourself with people that you've shown compassion and that you've cared for, and that you know, you've had some kind of positive relationship with, well, it's going to be pretty good, right? Because for one, there's not going to be a lot of fakery in that, right? There will be some, but it'll get weeded out fairly quickly. You know, and this is very specific to surrounding yourself with people that you care about and that you care for. If you have just one person that you care a lot about and care for, then they could be pulling the wool over your eyes the whole time. But if you surround yourself with them, somebody's going to figure it out. The group becomes really powerful because everybody cares about each other. So you're not going to just let things slide. You're not going to let people get away with dirt, so on and so forth. Any questions? Okay, so that's intuition. Intuition is that first kind of, you walk in and you got to figure out what it is that you need to do for the people who are there in the moment, living in that moment. The second element, and much more important element, is empathy. Empathy is a sense. And if you don't have empathy as a sense, you have to learn, just like anybody else who's missing a sense, you have to learn how to adapt to live in a world in which you don't have access to that sense. It is possible. It's actually almost kind of easy in a way. But it's always emulation. That doesn't work very well for care ethics. Emulation doesn't work very well. Care ethics needs empathy in a very different kind of way than most other ethical systems and our day-to-day life. Because part of what makes us happy, part of what makes us have a good life, is seeing the results of our good actions, seeing the results of caring for others and being a nurturing person. Keep in mind that while this is a feminist theory and a lot of the conversation leads towards issues that feminist theory takes seriously, right? Doesn't mean that all of a sudden, just because we have a theory that takes women seriously, it must be bad. That's idiotic, right? It isn't that that stuff wasn't important, it's that it's been ignored for human history until fairly recently. So now we have a theory that takes that stuff seriously. But it didn't just drop everything else. Still takes seriously things like living a good life and being happy. It's just now we look at that and say, here is one of the paths to being happy. Making other people happy. That shit's contagious, I'm telling you. You make people happy, you're going to be happy. If you sacrifice yourself to make people happy, you're going to suffer, and you're going to surround yourself with people who are glad to siphon that stuff off. Somebody who actually cares about you isn't going to let you sacrifice for them all the time. So if you're doing care ethics right, you can't. It's impossible to sacrifice yourself for everyone. People won't stand for it. If you're surrounding yourself with people that you care about and that have this kind of mutuality, they're going to stop you from sacrificing yourself. Like, you don't need to go that far. I'm happy with just whatever whatever the relationship is based on, whether it be loyalty or kindness or concern or whatever. Those things are important. You don't have to give away everything that you have, whether that be mental acumen or physical material items, etc. You don't have to do that. People can be mutual without having there be these grand exchanges. It can just be simple exchanges. Hey, I care about you, and I care about whether you're happy or whether you've had a good day, or like, talk to me. Let's talk about stuff. That's sufficient for a lot of people. That's the kind of concern, that focus, that makes them happy. Hey, somebody out there cares about it. Good enough. That's a good start. And if you surround yourself with that, then that cycle becomes self-sustained. Those people become protective. They become powerful. They become protective. Here, I said that. Defensive is the word I was actually looking for there. They become defensive, right? You create that herd circle. Well, some of you might remember from week 2 when we were talking about egoism. I talked about how we were both pack and herd, and how some theories focus on pack and some theories focus on herd. Care ethics focuses on herd, like hardcore. It sort of could care less about pack. And you might find some formulations of the theory that wish to get away from pack entirely, right? This concept of competition and alpha leadership and these kinds of things that are relevant to pack mentality. So by surrounding yourself with people who you care about, and then having the right kind of empathy to know how they feel, to be able to feel as they feel, there's a reciprocity, right? And we're assuming that the people that you surround yourself with also have empathy and are feeling that return from you. There's this kind of closed loop between each person. And as you collect up those closed loops, they just build up, build up, build up. And they're much, much more than the sum of their parts. So these are these results that I'm talking about, right? When we're talking about the results of our interactions with people, it's like creating these little cyclical circles that build up two people in a relationship. And I mean relationship in the grand scheme, right? Not any kind of intimate relationship, but just two people who interact. You can have a relationship with the cashier at the grocery store. Maybe you see him every 2 weeks. Maybe you see him every week. Right? You definitely will have a relationship with someone like your doctor or your therapist or your anyone else who deals with you on that kind of intimate level. Right? So, Your doctor may have a relationship with a lot of people, but it doesn't change the fact that she's got relationships. You might have relationships with a lot of people, and none of them be intimate. You can have romantic intimacy, you can have familial intimacy, and you can have just plain closeness, which is should be the majority of our relationships. Just kind of plain closeness that we have with our good friends. There's nothing weird about that. There's nothing secondary. It's just two people who care about each other's well-being, that care about what those people are up to and whether they're enjoying their lives. That's all you need. And as those build, your ethical stance will grow, right? So each person requires a new set of responses. Each person complicates responses, right? Especially if you have a large enough group. When you're trying to find the thing that pleases the most people, we all know how that goes, right? Sometimes you're going to piss some people off. It's not about the most. It's not raw numbers. Sometimes making one person really happy is worth, pissing off a whole lot of people. That's okay. That makes sense? Are we on board with all this? Okay, read up on this. There are a lot of directions that this goes, and with the exception of the 4 pillars, most of it is really fluid. You just have to remember the one key element that makes care ethics unique from other systems, and that's this reversed focus on relationships. Okay? All ethical theories deal with relationships, but none of them do it in the way that care ethics does. Now, for the purposes of categorization, care ethics does fall within virtue theory for a number of reasons. First off, it's just that's where it first got tossed because those first sets of theories were really closely related. But also on top of that, it's so heavily interdisciplinary that people lose focus on the good philosophy, on having that rigorous logical standard, and just throw a bunch of crap around. That can really modify things. So we have to focus on this one bit, your relationships. And when we're talking about your relationships, that seems very virtue-like in the sense that you're the person who builds your relationships. And therefore, it's kind of this personally centric, not egocentric, right? Because we really don't have a belief about how other people should act. Care ethics does not care about how other people act. It's not what it's about. It doesn't mean that it's not judgmental, right? You can still judge other people based on their actions. That's not the focus. It's not what we're doing with care ethics. So it seems to fit best within virtue, as opposed to an ego standard. Okay, so that's all I got for this week. A lot to read, a lot of directions to go in. This is a teleological theory. It is end-focused. So I missed that when I was doing the categorization. So it's a teleological, virtue-based system. Yeah, everything else should be fairly easy to acquire based on a little bit of notes. The lecture notes are purposely rather vague and short. And it's because this system is just all over the place. But I do recommend going to the optional video lectures. They're long, and there's quite a bit of rambling. There's a lot of psychology going on. But if you can get through them, listening to Carol Gilligan talk about care ethics from the source. She was one of the early authors. Kind of really helps you get a handle on at least where it started. There is a difference, and this is important. There is a difference between care ethics and feminist ethics. Care ethics is a feminist ethic, but it is not the or the only, or even within the category of feminist ethics, because there's no real category of feminist ethics that's separate from the others. It's a kind of secondary category. So that means that for your 2 assigned readings this week, care ethics and feminist ethics, you're going to be reading about 2 different kinds of things. That's important. Remember that. Okay. Any questions, last minutes? Anybody need to talk to me privately? Any of that kind of stuff? Otherwise, go away. Have a great week. Hope you enjoyed your 4th. See you next week.
I have a question about the presentation project.
Sure.
Is it supposed to be